Hey, good to see you all again. Where we left off, Professor Elie Wiesel was beginning to teach in university at the invitation of Rabbi Greenberg, who is a great, important Jewish thinker, theologian, rabbinic figure, who's had a lot of influence in the Jewish world and continues to, is a teacher of mine as well and an advisor to the Witness Institute. And that invitation was really life-changing. To have the vision to invite Elie Wiesel to begin teaching at university, you have to be a special person of vision. And that was Rabbi Greenberg. Professor Wiesel started teaching at City University of New York, and then moved in a few years to Boston University, where he taught for almost 40 years, where several of us here studied with him, where one of us here worked with him for 35 plus years. That's Martha Hauptman, who's with us today. And we've talked about Martha before and her important role there. In many ways, we're going to see the series of events that moved Professor Elie Wiesel from playing a really important role among a certain layer of the intelligentsia, the intellectuals in New York and in other places, in Paris and Jerusalem, to becoming the global figure that he became and having the global impact that he had. We're going to see how that developed, and we're going to see some of the themes and preoccupations and obsessions, in his own words, the obsessions that accompanied him throughout his life and career. And in many ways, those obsessions really begin with a movement, a fundamental movement from silence to song, from silence to song. But before we begin, I just want to share a very small correction small but significant correction to our time together. Last week, I mentioned that Professor Wiesel's teacher, the enigmatic Shoshani, was buried in Argentina. He's buried in Uruguay, not Argentina. There are stories about him appearing in Buenos Aires that are worth looking into. So if you Google search some of that, you'll find some of the many mysterious stories about Shoshani disappearing and appearing in another country. Some of those take place in Paris, some in Jerusalem, some in Argentina, but he's buried in Uruguay. And again, Professor Wiesel paid for and wrote the text of his headstone. Here lies Shoshani, whose life is wrapped in enigma and mystery. So we return to Professor Wiesel now and the silence with which he wrestled for much of his life. You know that in Jewish thought, in Jewish mystical thought, in philosophical thought in general, there are different varieties of silence. There's a certain kind of silence which represents agreement or love and closeness. If you're spending time with someone you love and you're silent together, that can be a mark of closeness where you don't need to speak. There are other kinds of silence, the awkward silence, the dreaded awkward silence when someone says something a little bit off color or that doesn't quite fit the tone of the conversation. There are many kinds of silence, but there's one kind of silence which really represents a kind of sin or blemish against humanity, and that is the silence when people see the suffering of other people. And it was this silence in the face of the Holocaust that Elie Wiesel became deeply sensitive and sensitized to, and that drove him in much of his work. So to go backwards in time, remember, Elie Wiesel and his family were placed in a ghetto in Siget, in his town, his small town in Romania, or Transylvania, Hungary, depending on how the borders were moving in those years. And remember, I told you that they had access to the BBC radio. So they had access to the world conversation about the news of the world, including the news of Hungary, the news of Eastern Europe, the movements of the Nazis. And they heard nothing about concentration camps. They didn't hear the word Auschwitz on the BBC. They didn't hear the word Treblinka on the BBC radio. They didn't hear any reference to what was truly happening. And therefore, they were unprepared, and they didn't know what was really happening, and they didn't know the consequences of getting on the trains. And so the experiences recounted in Night, and the experience of the kingdom of Night, the concentration camps, the empire of the Nazis, the attempt to destroy every last vestige of Judaism and every last Jew, every man, woman, and child, even if one grandparent is Jewish, to wipe out Judaism, all of that is recounted in the literature of the Holocaust. And after reading Night, you know probably that the experience was devastating for Elie Wiesel in many, many ways. The loss of his family, the loss of the world in which he had grown up. But in one of his early visits to New York, he met with Jewish communal professionals at the theUJA Federation of New York, which is the central organizing body of the philanthropic Jewish community. And he sat with them. And this is what he said to them. He said, what we went through was terrible. But even after the experience of the Holocaust, we had some degree of hope that humanity didn't really know. The world didn't really know what was happening. The Nazis were probably hiding their genocidal activities. And it must be the case that the Western governments, the United States government, the government of the UK, others didn't really understand the extent of what was happening, the attempt to destroy the Jewish people. And that explains the relative silence of the Western powers, who, even when they were prosecuting the war against the Nazis, did not devote significant resources, for the most part, to interrupting the final solution, the destruction of the Jews. Remember, there was an attempt to convince Roosevelt to bomb the tracks, the railroad tracks to Auschwitz, to interrupt the flow of Jewish prisoners to the death camp. Roosevelt refused. There are many, many stories about the refusal of Western powers to respond specifically to the Holocaust, even while they were fighting the war, World War II, against the Nazis and the Axis powers. But Professor Wiesel said to these American Jewish leaders in New York, years after the war, I was able to go on because I thought that the world surely didn't know. But had I realized that the world did know, and had I realized that even many American Jewish leaders knew what was happening and did not organize in a powerful, responsive way to stop the genocide of our people, if I had known that right after the war, as a young teenager who had lost everything, I would not have been able to go on. That deafening silence was something that he carried with him throughout his life. And remember, the first title of the book that would become Night, the original version written in Yiddish, a much longer book, we talked about this briefly last time, was called And the World Remained Silent. And the World Remained Silent. So in Elie Wiesel's developing, evolving philosophy, an approach to life, an approach to human suffering, an approach to human responsibility, hatred and evil and destruction and oppression are not, in fact, the worst of all things. They're obviously terrible. But even worse than hatred, even worse than evil, even worse than oppression is the silence, the indifference that allows such things to happen without a response. And the lesson that he learned from this, which he said stated over and over again very elegantly, was because we suffered, no one else should ever have to suffer. And because when we suffered, the world was silent. When others suffer, they should never hear our silence. We need to respond. And sometimes in this context, he would share a legend from Jewish tradition about the land of Sodom and Gomorrah, the wicked city-state, twin city-state of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And according to the legend, the rabbinic legend, the rabbis tell a story of a man who every single day went to the town square in Sodom to protest the wickedness of the city, the oppression of the vulnerable, the marginalization of the weak and the different, the cruelty to strangers that characterized that city. And every day he went with a sign. We can imagine a picket sign written on oak tag with a piece of wood, and he would march around the town square every single day protesting the wickedness of the city. He did this for years and years and years, and the city remained as wicked as before. And finally, a young boy approaches the man and says, I don't understand. Why are you protesting? Why are you doing this every single day for so many years? Don't you see? Nothing is changing. Nothing is changing. Look around you. The city is as wicked as it ever was. Not a single policy has changed because of your protest. And the man said, I'm not protesting to change the city. I'm protesting so that they do not change me. And this became a guiding principle in the young Elie Wiesel's work and in his life and in his activities as a writer, as a teacher, as a journalist, as an activist. We cannot be silent in the face of suffering. And so in many ways, the period from the 70s on was a period of Professor Wiesel really not finding his voice, because he found his voice earlier as a writer. He found his voice in writing Night. And he found his voice as a teacher in those early years. And he was a journalist. He wrote many articles and interviewed many important figures. But it was about amplifying his voice and finding ways to share that voice and to spark other people to speak up as well, so that the world would never again remain silent in the face of human suffering. It begins with silence, and it begins with a response to silence. It begins with a concern that the world's silence is what allows more suffering to happen. And when we say never again, the phrase is bankrupt if we don't back it with a real commitment, a consistent commitment to at least speaking up, at least protesting when other people are suffering. He was developing all of this at a time when our access to information was becoming greater and greater, of course. So it was much more difficult, and has become even more difficult in the passing years, to claim that we don't know what's happening somewhere in the world. We know what's happening everywhere in the world. The challenge we have is we have too much information, and we have to find ways of sifting the information to figure out what's really true and what's fake news. But we know that people are suffering in different parts of the world, and therefore we have a responsibility. And the first moral act in Professor Wiesel's teaching is to not look away from human suffering, to not avoid it, to not numb out, to not watch a lot of Netflix because you don't want to deal with what's happening in the world. This is an occupational hazard of being human now. We have so much information and so much contact with suffering, and it's overwhelming. We have that impulse. It's a self-protective impulse. I have this impulse. I'm aware of this impulse. I have compassion for it. But the first move in being a moral person today is to not look away. The second move is, when you don't look away and you're looking at suffering, how do you not give in to despair? And we'll come back to that question. To return to Professor Wiesel, in the late 70s, he's teaching at Boston University. Several things happen over the ensuing years. He has an encounter with the President of the United States in 1985, when he is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his work on behalf of oppressed people in the world. President Reagan is going to present Elie Wiesel with a Medal of Achievement, and Elie Wiesel uses that occasion to speak truth to power and to call out the sitting United States president for his planned visit to a cemetery in Germany, the Bitburg Cemetery, where SS officers, Nazi officers, are buried. And famously, Elie Wiesel says to the president, "Mr. President, that place is not your place. Your place is with the victims of the SS, not with the SS." There are two things that are very interesting to note about that encounter. Number one, President Reagan continued with his plan. He visited the Bitburg Cemetery, but he added a visit to the camps as well to kind of balance it out. You can't really balance such things out, but Professor Wiesel's voice had an impact, but didn't really achieve the ultimately desired result of getting the president to cancel his plans. And the second thing that's important to note is that, and this only came out much later, Professor Wiesel gave his remarks to President Reagan in advance. Because on the one hand, Elie Wiesel was someone with the passion and commitment to speak truth to power. On the other hand, he was a mensch through and through, and he wanted to make sure that he's not embarrassing the president. How do you hold that line of calling someone out, but doing it in a human, respectful way? That's something we need to relearn today across our political divide. Professor Wiesel was very elegant in those moments. He gave his remarks in advance to Reagan so Reagan could review the remarks and not be surprised. And when you watch the video, you'll see President Reagan sitting there listening as Professor Wiesel calls him out, and he knew what was coming. To his credit, he sat there and took it. He sat there and listened. The following year, Elie Wiesel was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and these two events brought attention to his activities across the globe. You can go online and see his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and you can also read or watch his Nobel lecture, which are both really important historical documents, not just historical documents, but statements of an approach to moral intervention at a global scale. It's sort of an document that can inspire us today to think about how we respond to people who are suffering today in the world, or to injustices in the world, or to oppression. It's a document that points the way for us. As Professor Wiesel was walking up to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, he wrote later, and he told us in the classroom also, he saw his father in the room among all the dignitaries. He had a vision of his father. He literally saw his father. And so he froze before he went up to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is very typical. As Elie Wiesel's profile grew, as his platform, we would say, in our modern jargon, grew, as his impact and his influence grew, he stayed very deeply connected to his roots. And so, for example, in the classroom, students at Boston University, students would sometimes ask him, "Professor, what is it like to be in the White House with the President of the United States?" Because they wanted to know. It's a rare opportunity to ask your literature professor, what's it like to be in the White House? And he would often say, "Well, I always leave the White House hungry." And students would say, "Why?" And he would say, "Well, they order kosher food for me, which I really appreciate. It's a mark of hospitality. It's beautiful. But when I'm speaking to the president, when I'm speaking, I can't be eating because I'm speaking. And when the president is speaking, how can I eat? So I always leave the White House hungry." But then he would add, "I always think of my parents. I think of my parents when I'm there and what they would say, and what an ironic historical experience my life represents, that a boy from a little town, a yeshiva bacher, a yeshiva student, a Jewish student, who loved to study the Bible and rabbinic legends, should be sitting with the President of the United States talking about world events." What a strange sense of humor history has. In 1990, Professor Wiesel published his book From the Kingdom of Memory, which is a book of essays that I highly recommend to all of you because it's both current and timeless. That same year, Professor Wiesel met a shy teenager from New York City and invited him to come visit and bring some questions. That was me, and that was something that Professor Wiesel did often with young people. So as he was impacting the world stage and the conversation about conscience and morality and intervention in genocide and changing policies at the International Criminal Court and at the United States State Department and the United Nations, he was also teaching in the classroom, and he was reaching out and inviting students to come bring questions to him. And this is also very typical. How many great leaders are wonderful, powerful, charismatic on the world stage, but aren't so nice to their own families, or don't see the people who cook their meals or drive them places? And Professor Wiesel wasn't like that. And as I've traveled across the country and to other countries to talk about Professor Wiesel's legacy and his teachings, people will often approach me and tell me stories of their encounters with him. And they're often these very simple moments where he was incredibly sensitive to them and respectful to them. One man in Philadelphia told me that he was assigned by his synagogue to pick up Professor Wiesel at the airport. And he arrived at the airport and he walked around the car and he opened the back door of the car and gestured for Professor Wiesel to get in. And Professor Wiesel looked at him and said, "Are you expecting anyone else?" He said, "No." Professor Wiesel said, "I'll sit up front with you. I'm not going to sit in the back. You're not my chauffeur." And he sat in front and they talked the whole way to the synagogue. It's a small human moment. It's the kind of thing that all of you would do, but it's the kind of thing that you don't necessarily find among people with global impact. And that was very typical of Professor Wiesel. So in all of this, in his teaching, in his writing, and he's publishing book after book, novels, nonfiction books, explorations, examinations, portraits of biblical characters, rabbinic figures, Hasidic masters. He's responding to world events. He's writing op-eds in the New York Times. He's organizing Nobel laureates to come together and discuss issues facing the future of the human race, the anatomy of hate, responses to genocide in different parts of the world. Professor Wiesel is preoccupied with several key themes that he comes back to over and over again in his writing. They appear throughout his writing. And I want to speak about three of them. But before I speak about those three themes, I want to share one really important meta principle in Professor Wiesel's teaching, writing, and activity. And it's a principle that comes from his personality, his deepest sense of self, but it also comes from his Jewish background. And it is his deep and abiding celebration of questions. Professor Wiesel loved questions, and he saw questions as the beginning of wisdom, the beginning of knowledge. He often said that questions open things up, answers close things down. Answers can separate people. You and I might have a different answer to a problem that we face, but the questions can bring us together. They can invite us into a dialogue, into a discussion, into learning, into mutuality, reciprocity, connection. He often said that the Hebrew word for question, she'elah, contains the word for God, El. The question contains God. God is in the question. And there is a quest in question. And the fanatics of the world only have answers and no questions. But I only have questions and no answers, he would say. And that's why we are opposed to one another. So he preferred the questions, and he believed that spending time with the questions is important. And we live in a society that emphasizes answers and that jumps very quickly to the answers. We're dealing with a major environmental crisis. What's the policy solution? I want it right now. We are polarized as a nation and other nations as well. We want to solve our civic problems. We want answers right now. We want the policy, the solution, the answer. We don't take the time to spend living in and swimming in the questions. And that is one of the reasons that we often get the answers wrong. By the way, he also taught me, and I think he taught many of his students, the difference between two very, very different things that are often confused for one another. The difference between an answer and a response. There are certain questions, it's good to ask questions in general, but there are certain questions that are so big, that are so powerful, that are so enduring, that to answer them is offensive. One of these questions is, why did the Holocaust happen? Why did God allow the Holocaust to happen? The question is a critically important question that accompanied Elie Wiesel throughout his life. And it's a question that he said, I would never accept an answer to, because any answer you could possibly give to that question would be an offense. There were great rabbis who answered the question of why did God allow the Holocaust by saying that it was a response to the Jewish people's sins. And to this, Elie Wiesel would say, how dare you justify or rationalize the murder of over 1 million children? The answer is more offensive than the lack of an answer. The question is important. The question can generate not answers, but responses. The question can generate, for example, a greater heightened sensitivity to other people's suffering. Any answer to the question of the Holocaust is offensive, but any response that leads you to take more responsibility for the world around you is a good response. And a response doesn't close down the possibility of other responses. A good question will generate multiple responses, and answers close things down. This is important to say because one of Professor Wiesel's favorite phrases, and those of you who had the privilege of studying with him know this, or if you heard him lecture, you heard this phrase often. One of his favorite phrases was, and yet. So if you heard him lecture, he would often approach or explore an issue from multiple angles. And as he developed a certain angle of approach, a certain argument, a certain analysis of a theme, let's say exile, or war and peace, or moral society, or a portrait of Rabbi Akiva, or the Baal Shem Tov, he would shift his way of thinking in the middle of a discourse, in the middle of a lecture, with the phrase, and yet. And the phrase, and yet, is a key that allows you to unlock new ways of looking. It frees you from the temptation, the lure of ideology and dogma and rigid thinking. If you've developed a great way of analyzing our current political moment, you might very likely become attached to that way of analyzing the current political moment, because maybe you worked hard for it. Maybe you're emotionally invested in it. The phrase, and yet, allows you to gently let go of everything you think you know and to begin to look again. It also allows us to do something really important, which is to hold two different ideas that seem to be contradictory or in tension with one another at the same time. For example, we believe very deeply in kindness and forgiveness, and yet we believe in justice and accountability. You can say it the other way. We believe in accountability and justice, and yet we believe in forgiveness and kindness. This is one of the tensions in our current political moment. And the phrase, and yet, is one of the keys to understanding Professor Wiesel's approach to all the issues he explored, and specifically to the three that I want to highlight today. So the three that I want to talk about today are faith, madness, and language, and the limits of language. We talked last time about Professor Wiesel's childhood experience of faith. His rootedness in Jewish tradition, his love of study, his mystical inclinations, his romantic inclinations, his way of thinking about the coming of the Messiah, the yearning that Jews for generations have had for a world that is healed. The way that as a child he spent time studying when other kids were outside playing. And he recited Psalms, and he yearned and prayed and had a conversation with God. And if you read Night, you know that that faith was shattered in the kingdom of night. It was shattered in the experiences and events of the Holocaust and the loss of his family. And you know that famous passage in Night where he writes of this. There are a few passages, but the one that's often quoted is, "Never shall I forget that night." And one of the lines of that never, and if you notice carefully, how many times does it say the word never in that famous passage? It's 8 times, 7 times, and then one more time. And this is a very Jewish number, because 7 is the number of creation, of nature, of the Sabbath, of the normal course of things, and 8 is the supernatural number. And Professor Wiesel was deeply in touch with these profound meanings of numbers. And when he says never 8 times, he's implying that even beyond nature, even beyond psychology, the shattering of faith extends beyond this world, beyond the human realm. The universe itself, the cosmos itself, is wounded by what's happening here. And one of those lines is very clearly indicates that Professor Wiesel's faith in God is shattered forever. But we know that throughout his life, after the Holocaust and after the war and liberation and the orphanage and being a journalist and a student and traveling the world and becoming an author and becoming a teacher, he continued to practice many aspects of traditional Jewish life. He studied Talmud every day. He wore phylacteries every day. He put on tefillin on his arm and on his head every day. He celebrated Shabbat. When we would ask him about this, he would often say, "How could I be the last? How could I be the last in my chain, the chain of my family tradition?" He would say, "I'm descended from Rashi. The great medieval commentator Rashi is an ancestor of mine. And the Shlah HaKadosh, the holy Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz, who's a very well-known mystic. And how could I be the last in my family? I owe it to my father and his father, my mother and her mother before them to continue the tradition and be a link in the chain." But that has nothing to do with God, does it? That's loyalty to the ancestors, loyalty to the parents and grandparents. What about God? So after the war, Professor Wiesel developed what he called a wounded faith, which is a new way of relating to God in which you challenge, you bring all of your questions. And the questions that Elie Wiesel asked about God were profound and universe shaking. God, how could you be silent? How could you watch what was happening during those years and remain silent and allow it to happen? We're supposed to have some kind of relationship here. You're supposed to take care of us. We're supposed to perform the commandments and live a Jewish life, and you're supposed to take care of your people. Where were you? These questions have no answers. And many people think that if you have such questions, there's no way to live a life of faith. But Professor Wiesel argued just the opposite. The questions themselves can deepen your faith. And he called that approach a wounded faith. Destroying the binary that we often are presented with between faith and doubt or faith and questions. There's no real distinction between faith and questions. The distinction is between faith and indifference, or faith and disengagement. Turning away from the conversation is the opposite of faith. Staying in the conversation, arguing, pushing, challenging, judging God even. All of that can happen within a life of faith. And for students in Professor Wiesel's classes, especially Christian ministry students, this was a shocking and liberating idea. That you can live a life of faith with all of your questions. That I can be a questioner and a person of faith at the same time. And as an aside, I'll tell you that when I was 19 years old, I sat with Professor Wiesel in a hotel lobby in Jerusalem, and I was really wrestling with a lot of questions about faith. And I asked him, is it possible to build a life of faith entirely on doubt? Because I feel like all I have is doubts. All I have is questions. All I have is doubt. There's no certainty at all. There's not an inch of certainty, an ounce of certainty in me. And he said, if you have faith and doubt together, it's good. And it's better than just having faith. And that was the beginning of a long conversation that ended with a line that was kind of seared into my mind. He said, at the very end of the conversation, he said, remember, superficiality is the enemy of everything. Superficiality is the enemy of everything. He was saying this to a 19-year-old seeker, and it gave me permission to continue to ask my questions without feeling like I had to exit the Jewish community or the conversation about faith. And if you think about the role of religion in the world today, and the way that religion can be an incredible force for good, but can also cause a lot of problems, this approach to faith, a wounded faith, can humanize the conversation about religion and allow people who feel that they have to pick a side to know that, and yet, you don't have to pick a side. You can be in faith, you can be in question at the same time. And this is something that wasn't just a philosophy, it was something that Elie Wiesel lived in every fiber of his being. And once in class, he said, when in 120 years, when it's time for me to leave the world, according to the Talmud, when a person dies and goes to heaven, they ask the soul a set of 5 questions about your behavior in this world. Did you have integrity in your business dealings? Did you make time to study, to learn? They ask questions, but Professor Wiesel said, even before they ask me those questions, I'm going to have a question for God. And the student said, what's the question? He said, why? So when Professor Wiesel passed away, I imagined him going to the halls of heaven and asking that question. And as he taught us, the question itself can be redemptive even if we don't receive an answer. Madness. We spoke last time about Professor Wiesel's early experience of madness, his friends, his study of Kabbalah, of Jewish mysticism, the 2 friends who went mad. And that was one contact point with madness in his childhood. There was another, which I find still very striking and surprising. He told us that on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, everyone in the family had a job to do. Everyone had a volunteer opportunity in the Wiesel family. Professor Wiesel told us that his father, Shlomo Wiesel, would visit the political prisoners, the Jewish political prisoners, and he would help them. He would make sure that they were receiving the legal counsel that they needed. He would make sure they had the medical care that they needed if they needed that, or that they had a pathway to freedom. And he was very involved in those kinds of communal matters. His mother and sisters would visit people who were in the hospital, people who were sick in the hospital. And young Eliezer Wiesel's job on Shabbat, as a member of the family, was to visit the inmates in the insane asylum in Siget and bring them candy on Shabbat afternoon. That's what he did every Shabbat afternoon. He would go as a child to the insane asylum. And we asked him, weren't you afraid? He said, no, I like listening to their stories. They had very imaginative stories, and I always loved stories. So he had a little contact with madness as a child, but of course, his obsession with madness really came later, and it came from the sense that he had that the world itself had gone mad. That he looked around at a world that was dehumanizing people, that was murdering millions, that was choosing genocide and war over kindness and responsibility. The world itself went mad. And so he had a lot to say about this in his study of literature. He was drawn to characters who are mad, to authors who are mad. He liked Dostoevsky because Dostoevsky said, I have a new plan. My plan is to go mad. He liked characters who were mad or feigned madness. St. Joan of Arc, who heard voices in the bells telling her what to do. King David, before he was king, who pretended to be mad to escape the Philistine king. Odysseus, who pretended to be mad to avoid going to the Trojan War. It didn't work. But he really was obsessed with these themes in literature and in life. After the war, as a student, he studied psychopathology. He wanted to understand the science of madness, from a psychiatric and psychological perspective. But ultimately, he felt that when the world goes mad, we have to respond to that madness, not with sanity, because who can really define what sanity is, but with a better madness, what he called a mystical madness, the madness of hope. When the world is mad, intoxicated by evil and dehumanization, we have to choose a better madness. We have to choose to believe that the world can get better in spite of all the evidence of history. We have to do things that are crazy acts of generosity and solidarity with other people, even if they don't really make sense. And that's one of the reasons that Professor Wiesel loved the Hasidic masters, whom we are exploring together in one of the other classes, one of the other series, because many of the Hasidic masters were stark raving mad when it came to acts of kindness or generosity, or fervor for God, singing and dancing in public, giving away all their money. There were Hasidic masters who couldn't bear to keep $1 in the house overnight. If they hadn't given away all of their money to charity during the day, they wouldn't sleep well. This is a kind of madness in the eyes of the world, but it's the kind of madness that allows for new possibilities. And if you think about the sanity that has brought us to this past, the world we're living in today, the world we're living in where 1 million children go to sleep hungry every night, even though we have enough food to feed the entire world 2.5 times over, or a world facing environmental devastation and the loss of species in our own time, or the world in which people are still suffering from war and conflict, that's madness. What's going to help us to challenge and fix those painful problems? It's not the sanity of the world. The sanity of the world is what got us here. It's the embrace of a better kind of madness, new creative ideas that are considered absurd, weird, ahead of their time. That radical creativity, that radical hopefulness, that radical experimentation is a part of what we need. It's an ingredient to move the world forward. And finally, the third obsession of Professor Wiesel throughout his life was language, because he knew that the worst instances of oppression, of destruction, begin with words. They begin with language. They begin with the kind of language that dehumanizes in subtle ways other people, the kind of language that causes the listener to drop their guard and allow their moral, intuitive sensibility to be defeated or neutralized. And so you find among oppressive regimes that they don't say, we're going to murder a lot of Jewish men, women, and children. They call it the final solution. And you find the same thing under Stalin, the starvation of millions of people, of Stalin's own people, was named something that could allow people to stomach it. And language can obfuscate and can confuse and neutralize our moral sense, our moral passion. And that's how it begins. And so when you see the first signs of that kind of dehumanizing language, that kind of distancing language, you have to get you have to become alert. You have to become skeptical. You have to pay careful attention, because it begins with language, then it moves to gestures, then it becomes action, then ultimately it can be integrated with the law and the legal system and the state. That's what happened during World War II. That's what happens elsewhere in the world even today. We have to be very careful about language. And Professor Wiesel, drawing on his Jewish roots again, was very sensitive to language. He taught us that there are certain words that after the Holocaust have new secondary meanings that we have to take seriously. When we hear certain words, we have to tremble after the Holocaust. When we hear the word chimney, when we hear the word selection, which in the camps meant the choice, not the choice, the imposed choice of who's going to go to labor and who's going to go to the crematoria. When we hear the word collaborate, which is a word that we use a lot in our modern work world, it meant something else in those days. It meant someone who was supporting or helping the Nazis in their nefarious work. So Professor Wiesel didn't say, don't use those words. He just said, when you hear those words, you should tremble a little bit. You should be sensitive to these things. And we saw already that because language can be contaminated, because language can be infected, we have to be very careful in how we communicate. And he pointed this out throughout literature, ancient and modern literature. He pointed out, for example, that the very first murder took place. If you read the verse carefully, it says, and Cain said to Abel, and then he rose up and hit him. And Cain said to Abel, what? The Bible doesn't tell us anything because there was no real communication there. Because the Bible is telling us that when Cain is trying to speak but cannot communicate, then violence becomes his language. And the breakdown of communication, the breakdown of language leads to violence. This impacted a lot of Professor Wiesel's work as a writer. And if you read his books, you'll see that he's extremely careful about language, and his process of editing and re-editing his works was long and painstaking because he wanted to tell the story with great sensitivity to language and accuracy, especially in Night. And this is again why Night began as a very long book, almost 900 pages, and then became a very short book, 112, 113 pages, because how is it possible to use language, the limits of language, to tell such a story? So I want to end by going back to the beginning. We started with the challenge of silence, the world's silence in response to the Holocaust, the world's silence in response to human suffering. And Elie Wiesel's very powerful, lifelong commitment to fight that kind of silence, to give voice to the voiceless, to speak up when you see something wrong, to speak truth to power. What do you do when language breaks down and the words that you're speaking are not sufficient to change the course of history or even a certain policy? This is a challenge that he faced. He felt that occasionally he had an impact. This is how he said it to us. Occasionally I had an impact. At the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, DC in 1993, he had just come back from Yugoslavia. He spoke about what was happening in Yugoslavia, and his passionate plea, which was spontaneous, extemporaneous, because his notes were wet from the rain, because it was pouring rain that day. His passionate plea on behalf of the suffering in Yugoslavia convinced President Clinton to change the US policy on Yugoslavia and to send military aid to interrupt the genocide. That happened sometimes, but many times Professor Wiesel felt that words failed, that words were ineffective. When words fail, he would teach us, you have to sing. You have to move to the realm of song, which can move people in a way that words cannot. These were some of the key obsessions, not the only ones, the key themes, not the only ones, but some of the important ones of our teacher, Professor Elie Wiesel. I'll stop there and open up for your questions. Ari, if you can share the questions, that would be great.
People are sharing questions that I will share as well. I'm just editing something here. Okay, so I want to start with something that Jeffrey Stalro said in his quote to me. He said, Margaret Mahler, or Mailer, I don't know the pronunciation, the English psychoanalyst and famous object relations theorist, said that as adults we face the world and do one of two things, go mad or go into depression. This presentation gives a fascinating view of going mad and its hopefulness versus the depression of despair. So I wanted to share that. I thought that was...
Thank you, that's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Professor Wiesel would often say is, how can you not go mad after seeing things that he saw? And then the question is, what are you going to do with that madness? It can bring you to a kind of madness of despair, or it can bring you to the madness of hope.
I'm glad that you clarified where Shoshani is buried, because as I mentioned, we were sending David Wilner to go find the briefcase and he almost went to the wrong place. So he'll go to Uruguay and we'll see what we can find to fund CSP. And the alternative, I want to thank all of our donors for giving us money and helping us to support programs like this. And if you would like to support CSP, please do so at occsp.net, or you can find the briefcase for us in Uruguay. Eileen and Victor ask, do you know, did Elie Wiesel experience nightmares from his past experiences during the Holocaust?
He didn't talk about that to my knowledge, but he did say often that he had very serious insomnia. And he had insomnia because he was aware of what was happening right now in the world. You know, Professor Wiesel was a very even-keeled person. For someone who had been through those experiences, he was probably the most grounded, centered person I've ever met. And the only time that I ever saw him really angry was when he was speaking about something that was happening in the world right now, where the international community wasn't responding quickly enough or aggressively enough. And those are the things that literally kept him up at night. And he told us, his students, you know, explicitly and also by example, he taught us that we should not be sleeping well either. And I often tell audiences that I wish you good sleep at night. You know, I don't wish real insomnia on anyone. It's good to get a good night's sleep, especially these days. There's a lot of anxiety and stress already. But at least when we're awake, we should have insomnia. At least when we're awake, we should really be awake and alert and deeply aware of what's happening in the world, and it should really bother us. So that was the way that, not so much about his earlier experiences, although that was there, but more about the current experiences. And the last thing I'll say is, he did share with us that he was always afraid of police officers. And that was a holdover from his early experiences with, even before the Holocaust itself, with Hungarian police, who always represented figures of fear in his childhood.
Karen Hurwitz asked a question that would be very relevant today, but I don't know how relevant it was just, you know, a few years ago, but did Elie Wiesel ever talk about the rise of white nationalism, his fear for what could happen here in the United States? We just saw what can happen in the United States recently, and we've seen over the last 4 years, as A. Foxman told me personally when I spoke to him at the beginning about 4 years ago, about the opening of the sewer lid of America and what it might lead to, which unfortunately it has led to. So the question is, did Elie Wiesel ever talk about America and his fears for America with regard to racism, anti-Semitism, and so on?
He often talked about racism and anti-Semitism in the same breath, which we all should, balancing our particular Jewish identity and other issues, and also recognizing that we're not competing with one another, that a world that's more just is more just for everyone, and a world that's filled with injustice is going to affect everyone in a negative way. He spoke often of America with great love and gratitude, because America was the nation that gave him his citizenship for the first time since he was a child. And he knew what it was to be a stateless person and a refugee. So he spoke with great gratitude for this country, and he was also deeply aware of and spoke out about anti-Semitism and racism on the right, and white nationalism, white supremacism. One of the things I remember in his office, Martha, you probably remember this too. I remember often seeing the reports, the regular quarterly reports from the FBI and other agencies about white nationalist groups that Professor Wiesel was tracking. We spoke about it a couple of times. And he told me, you know, one of the great, these are scary groups, but one of the great redeeming factors is that they're so divided. And they're just splinter groups, and they're not united. And if they ever unite, that would be very scary. He quoted the Talmud, which said that in a totally different context about this, the city-states of Germany. The Talmud says in Tractate Megillah, it's a very strange and chilling thing. There are, I forget the number, 137 city-states in Germany. And if they ever unite, then the world will be in trouble. And Professor Wiesel quoted that as a kind of prescient statement about Nazism. But he also said it about white nationalism. So he was very concerned with that. He was also concerned with the extreme anti-Semitism that you find on the left. And he would talk about the 20th century as the century of the extremes of the right and the extremes of the left, fascism and communism, and the twin competing ideologies of the 20th century, which had only one thing in common, that was anti-Semitism. So he was very deeply aware of that, and he fought it in different moments. And when we have more time, we can talk about some of those things, but you can also look them up. You can see Professor Wiesel's writing and activism about neo-Nazis in Skokie, and other moments and events in his country that really also kept him up at night, because he believed that anti-Semitism is a marker and an indicator for all other forms of hatred. It's not distinct and separate and local. It's not parochial. It's not just a Jewish issue. It's the sign that racism is on its way. Hatred of the other in general is on its way. So absolutely, he was concerned about this, but until fairly late, he had a sense of comfort that they were so splintered. These groups were so splintered. There was a key moment I have to mention I'm forgetting the year now, what was it? In the mid-2000s, I can't remember. I was with him at Boston University around this time. He visited, and some of you know this, I think Ari, you and I may have talked about it, but he was visiting, I think he was visiting Chapman University, and part of that trip, he was in San Francisco at a conference, and he was accosted in an elevator by a white supremacist Holocaust denier who wanted to kidnap Elie Wiesel, keep him captive in a hotel room, and get him on video confessing that the Holocaust never happened. Fortunately, Professor Wiesel yelled. He yelled very loudly, and the guy ran away. And so thank God it didn't become what it could have been. But since then, he started traveling with a security detail, and that was a moment of kind of wake up for a lot of people in his immediate circle, that the world might be getting a little more dangerous.
As an aside, we got an email that I forwarded to you from Andrew Scott Bell, who's a film composer. He's been commissioned to adapt The Trial of God into an operetta, and he wants to talk. He's been finding these programs very relevant and interesting. He wanted you to talk a little bit more about The Trial of God, which I don't think we want to go into right now, but I emailed it to you so you can talk to him and get a credit in an operetta, which will continue the teaching and learning going forward. And we hope that Andrew will share a recording of the operetta with us so that I can share with everybody. Let's see. I have a question for you. How did Elie Wiesel choose the students? You said a lot of students wanted to go into his class. How did he choose who would get into the class? And how did he choose his TAs? Like, why did he choose you?
Well, the first question is really from Martha Hauptman, who's with us, but I'll give a version of it for the sake of time. But really, Martha was for 35 years the person who made those decisions. And I think I mentioned this in the first session, but what Martha said to me was that she wasn't only thinking about which students are qualified for the class, she was thinking about what kind of group, what kind of class body as a group of students would be the most enjoyable and rewarding for Professor Wiesel as a teacher. So she was looking for diversity, she was looking for different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of interests. And that was a remarkable thing. And I have to say, I wouldn't say this in other contexts, I'll say it here, but when Martha retired, I noticed that the process became less, let's say, brilliantly curatorial. I'm speaking delicately. It was still wonderful students, but that element really kind of wasn't there anymore, and it was noticeable. And I bet Professor Wiesel noticed it too. So, it's a real kind of art to develop a classroom and a group. We're doing it right now for the Witness Institute. We're putting together our fellowship. We're choosing fellows for a moral leadership fellowship inspired by Professor Wiesel's teachings. It's not only thinking about the individual students, it's thinking about the whole context and the group dynamic. And this is something that Martha did for decades. And I think was a great gift that you gave to Professor Wiesel and to the students, Martha. And as far as the TAs, I don't really know, actually. It's kind of a mystery. Martha knows, and I know that when Professor Wiesel invited me to be his TA, I was very surprised, and there was some sort of intuitive, mystical thing happening there. And Martha, maybe as a follow-up, maybe you can send me your thoughts and we can send them around, because I'd love to learn more about this myself. But I'll share that in addition to choosing the TA, Professor Wiesel would choose the course topics for the following year by asking the TA, what do you want to do next year? So he would ask me, what are you interested in learning next year? And that's 9 times out of 10, that would be the decision about the syllabus and the course readings and the course topic. So a great sense of respect for the students and inviting the students and the TAs to play that role in shaping the experience.
Debbie and Jeff asked a question about Elie Wiesel's legacy through his son, and wondering, it must have been tough to be Elie Wiesel's, child, and has he continued in his father's works or religious traditions, or, how does he handle the mantle of being Elie Wiesel's son?
Well, Professor Wiesel's son Elisha is a close friend and is also the president of the Witness Institute. We're partnering on that project, and he cares very deeply about his father's legacy. And he has spoken publicly about his own journey and his Jewish journey, and how as a young person, as a teenager, he rebelled against Jewish practice and Jewish tradition. He felt it was very confining, and he was into punk rock and video games, and there's a lot of tension there in terms of that part of his journey. But he has spoken publicly about how his father, how Professor Wiesel, was so deeply embracing and loving unconditionally of his son, and his son making those tough choices for a parent. I'm a parent of teenagers now, so I know how hard it can be to really embrace your kids when they're doing something that seems like way off or out of the box, or out of line in some way. And Elisha was one of those kids. So he said, he came home with I forget if it was a green or purple mohawk, and he said, my father put his arms around me, and he said, I wouldn't be embarrassed to go anywhere with you. We can go to shul together, we can go to synagogue together, anywhere you want to go. Happy to go anywhere with you. I'm not at all embarrassed to be seen with you. I love you. And the only thing he said was he wanted Elisha to marry Jewish and to say Kaddish for his father when the time came. And he said that the latter request, he realized, wasn't actually a request. It was a gift that his father gave him that opened the door for him to come back to exploring Judaism, which he has done in a very beautiful and profound way. He's very involved in Torah study now, and Talmud study. And I have to say, Elisha is a brilliant person and an incredibly articulate spokesperson for his own values, which reflect his father's values very deeply, and as well as his mother's values. His mother also, Mrs. Marion Wiesel, also is an activist in her own right, and was involved in civil rights work. It's appropriate for Martin Luther King weekend. She was very deeply involved in civil rights work in the South. And the two of them together created several really important initiatives, and Elisha inherited both of their deep moral sensibilities. So that arc you can read about. Maybe we'll find that article and send it around, Elisha's own story in his own words. But he is continuing his father's work through our work together, and as a public speaker, and occasionally as a writer. And the last thing I'll say about this is Elisha is also going through his father's files. There are many files that have not, in folders and boxes, that have not been archived yet. And he's finding things. And he found something recently that was just published, and it's available now in bookstores and on Amazon, called The Tale of a Nigun. The Tale of a Nigun. A nigun is a wordless melody. And it's a story in poem form. It's sort of almost a myth, but something that happened during the war. And it's brilliant. It's an unbelievably powerful piece by Elie Wiesel that had never really, it was published many years ago I think in the forward, but had not really seen the light of day, and now was published, illustrated by Mark Podwall, who did a lot of work with Professor Wiesel. And it's the most recent book to come out from Elie Wiesel's archive, so to speak. And I encourage you to look at it, The Tale of a Nigun.
I just put it in the text for everybody. I found The Tale of Nigun. So we have so many great questions, limited time. Cy Zilberstein wanted to know the relationship at all between Elie Wiesel and Martin Luther King. since it is Martin Luther King Day coming up tomorrow.
So he spoke about Dr. King, and he spoke about this in the context of the accomplishments and achievements of the civil rights movement and also the work yet to be done. And his take on that was that the civil rights movement did one thing that was very important. It made a separation between the legal system, officially, the revealed legal system on the books in the South and across the United States, and racism. So in other words, before the civil rights movement, it was unapologetically racist, and the law, local, state law, and at the national level too, was unapologetically, unabashedly racist, and it was entrenched and fixed in United States law. The civil rights movement changed that with the Civil Rights Act and other moments as well, but that didn't translate yet to the full renunciation or redemption of this country from racism, and that's a project that belongs primarily to educators. And Professor Wiesel really believed that education is the key to change those dynamics. It's not just about changing the law books, although that's critically important. And he was aware of the issues in mass incarceration and so on. The legal process, the legal challenge is not done yet. The evolution of our legal system to reflect those values of equity, we're not done with that work, but education is the critical component that can change the hearts and minds of new generations. So, he admired Dr. King. He often, in the context of these conversations, would give us a piece from Dr. King to read. Remember, we're talking about, in the classroom, we're talking about a class where we read a book a week, plus other articles or speeches. So I remember reading part of Letter from a Birmingham Jail, perhaps the whole thing, in one course on faith, and I'm getting the title wrong of the course, but it was something like Faith and Oppression, where we were looking at responses from a faith perspective to oppressive systems in the US, in Argentina, we were looking at liberation theology, and Dr. King played an important role in that course of study.
A few more questions that are amazing. Beth Elster asks, did Elie Wiesel, to your knowledge, ever speak about or on behalf of the Palestinians, and what do you feel about what the Jewish response should be? I know it's a charged question, but something definitely worth exploring.
It's a good question. Professor Wiesel spoke about the Palestinians with great sympathy in his Nobel either speech or lecture in 1986, which was several years before Arafat even began the process of recognizing the state of Israel. So pretty early days, well before Oslo well before Madrid and any other peace accords. And he wrote about this in Letter to a Young Palestinian in one of his books as well. I forget now if it's Kingdom of Memory or One Generation After. You can see that letter. He believed very deeply in sympathy for Palestinians, particularly young Palestinians. He was unapologetically Zionist. He believed that Zionism was the only modern liberation movement to have not descended into tyranny and oppression. And he held the tension between those two positions. As a proud Zionist, he believed that there would be peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, because he believed that everyday Israelis and everyday Palestinians, people on the street, want to raise their children in peace. And his analysis of the situation there, based on conversations with leaders on both sides, and remember, he hosted conferences where he brought people together. He brought Ehud Olmert and Abbas together at one of his conferences. It was the first time that the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the Palestinian Authority were able to have a conversation offline in a safe environment, off the record, which led to some really important developments along the way to the attempt at peacemaking, which was the Oslo Accords. So he believed very deeply in peacemaking and creating opportunities for dialogue. His analysis of the situation was that the Palestinian people are not to blame for what's happening in the Middle East, but the Palestinian leadership had refused, and this became more and more clear over time. They refused more and more generous offers that were brokered by the US administration. And worse, they funneled millions, if not billions of euros and dollars to their own personal coffers. And so when he saw photos of the homes and the Rolls Royces of leaders of the Palestinian Authority, while Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank were suffering from hunger, he was incensed. It was one of those times that he expressed real anger. But in spite of all of that, he believed that there would be peace. Sadly, he said to us several times, "I believe there will be peace there in my lifetime." So we have yet to see that fullness of peace that we hope for. But he didn't give up on it because he believed that peace won't come from governments in a top-down kind of way. It'll come, and this, I think he changed on this or evolved in this over time, because I think first he saw Oslo as a great hope and then was disappointed by it, like many of us were. The Oslo Accords did not lead to good results. They led to the Second Intifada and many deaths on both sides. But he believed over time that peace would come from more grassroots efforts to build relationships between Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims and Christians and others in that land. And that happens not through governmental talks and summits and conferences. It happens in smaller ways. So I think I share this belief that he taught me, especially towards the end of his life, that the grassroots efforts are really where the great hope is. We have to support those efforts to bring people together, not necessarily to talk about politics, maybe to sing together, to share the songs of their traditions. I have friends and colleagues who are doing that kind of work in Israel, between Israelis and Palestinians today. I think that's where his great optimism was. He believed very deeply in people. Here in America, he believed in the American people. He believed ultimately in the goodness of people in spite of everything he had seen. He also took very seriously the potential that people have to do great evil or to fall into indifference that allows great evil to happen, but he never gave up on people. And therefore he never gave up on peace.
So I'll just not let you off the hook on this question. Did he ever talk about being critical with regard to Israel and how it treated the other in Israel? Was that, in the Jewish world today, many people are not willing to criticize Israel. They love Israel. They may be Zionists, but they're not willing to critique Israel and how it treats others. And it could be Palestinians. It could be the issue with the Sudanese workers and the foreign workers in Israel. There are many social issues in Israel that are Israel's challenged with. Would he now be willing, do you think, if he were around, or was he willing to hold them to the same standard as he was hold any other country and how they treated other people in their society?
Well, I would say that the Jewish community right now is very divided and polarized on this issue, where you're right, there are Jews who will not criticize Israel no matter what, and there are Jews who love to criticize Israel and have no trouble criticizing Israel and holding it to a much higher standard than other nations. We find both phenomena in our communities. Some of it tracks to generational lines and demographic lines, but we don't find a lot of a kind of strong middle of people who criticize and support deeply at the same time, even though there are people who try to do that. So what Professor Wiesel said and did was, number one, he reserved his critique of Israeli policy for when he was in Israel, because he felt that if he criticized Israel from outside, it would be used in a context that was very anti-Israel at the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the international community, the European Union, conversations about Israel. He didn't want to feed that, what he saw as the machinery of extreme and exaggerated critique of Israel. So he reserved his critique for when he was there. And you can actually see some of his lectures when he was visiting Israel. His language is much more harif, it's much more hot and critical when he's there. And also when he was meeting with the prime minister of Israel, he would often raise those issues. And also it's important to note that you're talking about Israeli policy toward the other. Every nation struggles with these things. Israel struggles with the Palestinians, but also with other minority populations, some more, some less. The Druze community in Israel is very deeply integrated into Israeli society. Israeli Arabs split by demographic and class lines, but Israeli Arabs are in the courts and the bank system. There are execs in the bank who are Israeli Arabs, and the Knesset, the third largest party, although it keeps changing because Israel keeps having elections now, is an Israeli Arab party. So there's a lot of integration in Israel, actually, which is not a vision of Israel you necessarily get from reading the news and the critiques here. But there are other places where it's really problematic and there's racism. So foreign workers, but Professor Wiesel, together with Marion Wiesel, years ago focused on Ethiopian Jews who were coming to Israel, who in many ways were not receiving the same level of education and opportunity. They created a network of schools and integration centers for Ethiopian Jews called Beit Zipporah. I'll let you all know that right now they're in the midst of a fundraising effort for this in honor of Marion Wiesel's 90th birthday, which is coming up. They're having a big event on the 27th. Maybe we can send information out if any of you want to get involved with that. It's a really important cause and a beautiful cause that they both cared about very deeply. And you know, part of the challenge was not just to criticize, but to create responses that are, you know, effective. So they created a system of schools powerfully named after Elie Wiesel's little sister who was killed upon arrival in Auschwitz, Zipporah. Beit Zipporah is the system of schools and integration centers that they created for Ethiopian Jews. So that was something that he very much cared about, and Mrs. Wiesel still deeply cares about. And I think that was where he wanted to put a lot of energy with all of these issues. It wasn't just protest. Protest is the first step. Challenging the silence is the first step. Calling attention to the issues is the first step. But the second step is, can you develop models to respond to those problems and those challenges that are effective and that are sustainable? That's what he did in this regard with Ethiopian recent Olim, recent immigrants to Israel.
Last two questions. I've kept everybody over time, but it's a rare opportunity, so I might as well use it. Rabbi Charlie Savino, my good friend from New York, asked the question that he believes Professor Wiesel was against reunification of Germany. So I don't know if that's an issue you can even talk to, but the follow-up issue would be, how did he talk about Germany, Germans today? How did he deal, you know, how did he deal with the whole dealing with Germany today and in the aftermath of the Holocaust?
Well, Professor Wiesel's dear and close student, Reinhold Baschke, is here, and he's from Germany, and he should really answer that question. So again, Reinhold, maybe you'll write a response later that we can send around if you have the time, no pressure. I know you're very busy working on the major project of translating Professor Wiesel's works into German and also you're teaching. But what I can say is that Professor Wiesel was approached once by a student at a conference whose grandfather was an SS officer. And she asked Professor Wiesel, you know, how do I carry this guilt, and what do I do with my family name? Do I have to change the name? Do I have to change my last name? Is there a way to redeem this terrible family history? He said, we don't believe, in my tradition, we do not believe in collective guilt. And he believed very deeply that the next generation of German youth had taken the challenge, the moral challenge of their history very seriously, and were deeply engaged in a project of teshuvah, of collective fixing, repentance, return. And yes, there are extremes in Germany. There are right-wing movements and neo-Nazi and fascist movements, but for the most part, Germany took more collective responsibility than perhaps any other nation in modernity for the events of its own past. And so he invited that student to come study in Boston, and she came for several years and became his student as well. He also spoke from the terrace, the Reichstag terrace, where Hitler spoke, where Hitler gave several important, famous, terrible, destructive speeches. And in that speech where Professor Wiesel spoke from that spot, he invited the German government and the premier to come to Israel, to the Knesset, and apologize formally for the Holocaust to the Jewish people, because he said the German people have not formally apologized. And so we were talking earlier, I mentioned in passing, the tension, the and yet tension between accountability and forgiveness. So he often said, I cannot forgive anyone. I can't forgive on behalf of 6 million people who were killed. If someone did something to me, I can forgive. But if someone did something to 6 million people, there's no way I can forgive. It's not my role. I'm not a judge. I'm only a witness. But he felt that it was very important to build relationships and not hold people captive to the past and not engage in collective blame. But yes, to hold people accountable for their history and making public declarations of apology, of responsibility was also important to him. And at the same time, if there's a young German student whose grandfather was a Nazi officer, to say, we don't believe in collective guilt, come study with me, come become a graduate student in Boston. So I think that complex, nuanced, beautiful answer brought together accountability and forgiveness in a way that we can really learn from.
Thank you. We appreciate that answer. So my final question for today is, with Elie Wiesel no longer with us, who is our moral authority, whether here or in the world, that we should look for? Someone similar to Elie Wiesel who has something to say, who we should know about.
So I always say I can't speak for Professor Wiesel because he always surprised us. I don't know what he would say, but on this one I have a strong sense. I've been asked this question many times, and my answer is always the same, and I feel like this is something that he would agree with. I don't know for sure, but I think the answer is, I'm looking at all of you. There's a Hasidic teaching that when a great master passes away, all of the students and all of the followers, at whatever level of contact they had with the master, have to step up. And the metaphor that's used is when a great general is lost in battle, so all the corporals and privates, the enlisted people, have to grab whatever tools and weapons they can and rush to the front lines. And in those moments, that's when you become a moral leader. You're not a moral. No one's a moral leader because they're called a moral leader by the New York Times. People are moral leaders because they're helping people, because they're deeply responsive. They're trying to stop suffering in the world because they literally cannot sleep well because they know people are suffering, because they're engaged in the project of sensitizing themselves to gratuitous, preventable suffering. And they're raising their voices in protest, and they're developing creative experiments and responses. That's what moral leadership is. It's not, I don't think we're in a time when we have to look for an exemplar, although we may find exemplars, and that would be wonderful. I think it's a time where we each have to take responsibility and think about, what's one more thing that I can do in my own realm, with my own power, with my network and my connections and my resources, and it might be supporting an organization, and it might be reaching out to someone who's isolated, and it might be writing a poem or a story, and it might be reaching out to someone who is on the other side of the political divide and trying to create a dialogue with that person. And it might be thinking about who's going hungry in your neighborhood. There are a million ways of expressing moral leadership, but it's really up to us. And I mean it. I'm not ducking the question. I'm looking to all of you, and I look to all of us in these moments to take more and more responsibility. And if we each take a little more, if we do a little more, the world will look different and feel different in a way that we can measure. We'll be able to feel it. We'll be able to see a different kind of world. And if all of us stand up and say, you know what, we care about kindness, and we care about good dialogue, and we care about constructive conflict and respect, and we care about making sure that the most vulnerable among us have food and shelter and are not marginalized by politicians, and we are against violence and we are against indifference, if we all raise our voices, and some of us will be baritones, and some of us will be tenors, and some of us will be altos and some sopranos, and some of us will be speaking, and some of us will be singing, and some of us will be writing, and some of us will be dancing these messages, the world will look different. That's our job right now. It's really up to us.
I agree with you, but I also think we've seen what happens when you don't have moral leadership in the world or in a country. So everybody does have a responsibility, but I do think we need moral leaders, because as you showed us today, just by having Elie Wiesel around, he was able to, because he won the Nobel Peace Prize, because he was recognized with the Medal of Freedom, because he had access to presidents and powerful people, he had their ear, which allowed for changes that a normal person can't achieve. So I still think we need moral leaders. So maybe a challenge to everybody online is, email me over the next few days who you think a moral leader is, and we'll share that at our closing program next week. on Elie Wiesel. Also, people have asked questions about Elie Wiesel and whether he was involved with or knew about what's going on campuses in the United States that we're dealing with now. That we can talk about next week as well.
Ari, let me just jump in and respond to that for a moment.
Okay.
It's
Yes.
it's an important question and point. Absolutely, we need moral leadership. The moral leadership that we elect or create is a function of who we are and the choices that we're all making and the influence that we have on the people around us. They're not disconnected, number one. And number two, I agree with you, and that's why the work that I'm involved in right now, more than anything else, is about investing in moral leadership for the next generation. That's what the Witness Institute is all about. But there's no such thing as moral leadership in the sense that we are now off the hook. And I think we're living in a time when, because of the way our society is constructed and our culture, we emphasize celebrities, we emphasize superheroes, you know, it often puts us in the passenger seat or the spectator seat. And I know you agree with this, and I think they're both really important. We need to invest in moral leadership, and we also need to make sure that we're taking the fullness of our responsibility seriously, because there's a lot we can do. And you know, if you need to have a Nobel Peace Prize to make the world better, then, you know, I might as well throw it in, right? I mean, go back to watching Netflix. Students would ask Professor Wiesel that question often, like, Professor, you have a Nobel Prize and you have the resources to put an op-ed in the New York Times, which costs like $10,000, you know, and what can we do? We're just students. What can we do? And he would always say, look for the outstretched hand. It's not about scale. It begins with you. There's something you can do. Look for someone in your immediate vicinity who needs help, who needs a smile, who needs support, someone who's hungry, someone who's thirsty. That's where it begins. And yes, we also need the large-scale global work. And you know, what we're trying to do now is integrate those two pieces and bring people together who are working at an international scale with people who are doing work in their local communities or in a school, to really kind of honor the reality that we need work. We need healing work, and we need activism on all levels.
Thank you. Next week also, maybe we'll have some input from Reinhold as to how Elie Wiesel is read in Germany today. Since he's there, I'd like to know whether Elie Wiesel, what status he's held there, how he's read, and what is Reinhold like an outlier, or is Elie Wiesel like a read mainstream in Germany? It'd be nice to know from his perspective. So, boy, what are we going to do in our last class about Elie Wiesel? And then we're going to call it a day right now.
Well, we've started, actually. We're going to talk about his legacy for today. I was going to ask Reinhold to share a little bit of, Ari, I love that question you just asked. I was going to ask Reinhold to share a little bit of his first encounter with Professor Wiesel, which is an amazing, really beautiful story, but also to share the work that he's doing now to I think, to change the answer to that question about how Elie Wiesel is, how much reach, how much contact people have in Germany right now among young Germans and students and others. That's the work that Reinhold is doing, really, really important work. So we'll spend a few minutes on that, I hope, Reinhold, if that's okay with you. And we'll talk about the legacy for today, what some of the messages are, and we'll try to leave a bunch of time for more questions, because your questions are all really wonderful. I know we didn't get to all of them. And it's hard to believe it's our last session in the series. There's a lot more to talk about. We've really kind of skimmed the surface, but covered the broad strokes of his life. Now we have to talk about his legacy and his messages for today.
So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next Sunday in this series. But remember, Ariel is going to be here all week playing in the Lizard Lounge, right? Actually, the CSP Lounge. We have a program on Tuesday for CSP members. It's the third in our four-part series, The Greatest Jewish Tales, on Wednesday, late afternoon, early evening, stories by and about the Hasidic masters, and then Thursday, Tales of Conflict and Wrestling with Sacred Texts. Those are all ongoing programs, but we've uploaded a bunch of past programs if you've missed them to our CSP YouTube channel. If you go to occsp.net, you can find our YouTube channel there. I hope if you're not on our email list, you'll join our email list. Remember, tomorrow, Martin Luther King Day, we have a program live from the UK with Dr. Julia Wagner, Freudian Readings of Stiesel, Season 1 and 2, just for a little change up. And those of you who are CSP patrons and legacy people, you got a little break. We'll see you in about, 2.5 hours or so for a special CSP patron program, the Legacy Circle program with Ariel, entitled Jewish Diversity and Pluralism. So that's it. Nice having you all with us today. Keep safe. Get your vaccines. And hopefully we'll see you in person. I don't know, the next 6 months or so. Browers, nice having you with us again, and good to see everybody. And new people, nice to see you as well. Reinhold, nice to have you. Look forward to hearing from you next week. Betsy Antonoff, nice to see you. Sophia Zaslavsky, I can see you as well. I've got to go spend some quality time. Hi, Ricky Lippitz, nice to see you. I'm going to go spend some quality time with my kids. And so then I can see a bunch of you in just a few hours for our CSP patrons. If you're a patron or a legacy member and you don't have the sign in, you can email me, but I'll try to send you a reminder if you've registered how to join us. And look forward to seeing you guys soon. If not Monday, we'll see you hopefully on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Sunday. Take care. Bye, guys. Bye, Ariel.
Bye-bye.